It's a pleasure to have at the Capitola Book Cafe Gabriel Constans. He is here in honor of his new book, Buddha's Wife. Gabriel Constans is a local author whose contributions extend well beyond the world of writing. He has served our community and those abroad in the roles of grief counselor, chaplain, social worker, and massage therapist. He is a mental health consultant at the highly respected Santa Cruz Integrative Medicine and Chi Center, and he is an advisor to the Rwandan Orphans Project. Add to this wealth of knowledge, dedication, and generosity of spirit, Gabriel's literary efforts. He is a veteran freelance writer whose work has appeared in journals around the world, and an author and contributor to over 10 books. He joins us tonight to celebrate his latest. Buddha's Wife is a novel that explores the woman and the son who the Buddha left behind to pursue his spiritual life and teachings. Gabriel, a Buddhist since age 16, pours his studies and his own imagination into a tale filled with contradictions about the roles women have played or have been allowed to play in the religion. Buddha's Wife is also a story that conjures the richness of time and place and eloquently articulates love and loss, grief and forgiveness. Please welcome Gabriel Constans.
Hi, friends and family. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And thank you, Janet and the Capitola Book Cafe for holding this event. I've been doing book events all around the country and in Canada for this book. That was the nicest, most complete introduction I've had. Thank you very much. That was way more than who I am. This book started, the story of this is a novel. It's not historical fiction, it's a novel, even though there's a lot of historical facts in it. This story started about 2,500 years ago, and this book began about 40 years ago. And I'd like to tell you just briefly how this book came to be, and then I'll do a short reading from the book, a small part, and then have some time to converse, have people make comments, ask questions, and then afterwards we'll be here to sign and talk some more. So when I was 16, I lived in Northern California, north of San Francisco, in a town called Redding. It's not like Santa Cruz or Capitola or Santa Cruz County. I grew up a Methodist. The city was very conservative. I was one of, I think, 4 guys with long hair in the entire county at the time in 1970. And I was raised a Methodist, and that was about all I knew about religion, was that it was a thing you had to go to every week with your parents and sit through and be bored. And then I read Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda, and then I read Be Here Now by Ram Dass, and then I read Beginner's Mind, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Suzuki, and my whole world changed. And I realized that there was more than what I knew, much more, and that the possibilities were endless. But in being as where I lived, there weren't a lot of spiritual communities or groups around at the time. I still don't think there's that many there. But I did hear about a place in Mount Shasta called Mount Shasta Abbey, which is just northwest of the mountain, and it's very cold there. And it was run by an abbot named Jao Kennett. So I went to initiation, became a lay Buddhist there, and learned how to sit, how to be whacked on the shoulder to be awoken when I was falling asleep during sesshin, to wake up. And most importantly, I think in regards to this book, I learned how difficult it was for her to become a nun, and let alone to become a head abbot. She was one of the first women abbesses in North America. And she was, if not the one of the first women to be ordained in the Soto Zen tradition in Japan. Very hierarchical, very paternalistic, very difficult. And she spoke about that, and I always remember that, how difficult it was for her to get through that and what she had to endure. But even she never mentioned or talked about, or the monks or nuns at the monastery there never talked about Yashodhara, or never mentioned the Buddha's life before he became the Buddha. It was always afterwards in his teaching. So I never knew about her. And I, other than reading Siddhartha and vaguely having an idea that she existed, I didn't know anything. Some liquid Girl Scout chocolate mint tea is what it tastes like. That's what he said it tastes like, and it does. I got involved in different things throughout the years. After I moved here 35 years ago, became involved in yoga, different kinds of meditation, was a Quaker for a number of years. I worked at the hospital as a chaplain. I converted to Catholic for about 3 years because I had a girlfriend at the time who was Jewish and wanted to become Catholic. And she was involved with coworkers of Mother Teresa, which I really respected and got involved with them. And we did a lot of things around this community with that. So I went to Mass for many years. There was an amazing priest at Holy Cross then. But the thing through all the years that has stayed with me is sitting, is meditation that I learned at Shasta Abbey almost 40 years ago. And then about 22 years ago, when Audrey and I were on our honeymoon, of all places in Sweden, our friend was reading a book, a novel that was called Magdalene, Mary Magdalene. And it was life from her perspective of what it may have been like, and had a lot of history involved in it. And our friend named Chris, who's actually English but married a woman, Ava, who's Swedish, he said, well, wasn't the Buddha married a long time ago? And I said, well, I think so, but I don't know anything about her. And he said, you should write a book about her, like a novel or something. And this is about 22 years ago. And I said, oh, yeah, sure, that's a good idea. But when we got back to the States, I kept thinking about it over and over. And I tried to find information about Yashodhara and her family and what had happened to her after Siddhartha at the time left her and their newborn son Rahula 2 days after he was born and didn't come back for 12 years. And I wondered, why? I wonder if that affected her at all. I wonder if her or the family had any, little reaction to that, or was slightly upset or anything. So at the time there wasn't any internet. You remember those days when there was no internet? It was like just 20 years ago. So I went to the biggest libraries I could find there, to Stanford and Berkeley, and I looked up everything I could in English about Yashodhara. And the extent, all the stuff I could find was 2 sentences. 2 sentences written about her. It says, she was married to Siddhartha, had a son, her father was so-and-so, her husband later became the Buddha. And that was about all. So I thought, well, this could be a really fascinating story to write about my perception of what may have happened. In the meantime, I have learned a lot more, and there's been a lot more studies done and oral traditions passed on about her, and there is a lot known. But that's what led me to writing this story. And it takes place in northern India, which is now known as Nepal, which is where they lived. Yashodhara was a princess from a neighboring group of people, clan, community, and Siddhartha was also. And when they were 16 is when they met, and they were betrothed. They got married at 19. This is an actuality. This is, in this part, I keep the same in the story as well. And then they were married and for 10 years before they had a child. And this was their only child. And the other interesting thing is Rahula, which he named their son, means to fetter or to hold back. So 2 days after their only child, after 10 years of marriage, was born, he left them in the middle of the night. And I always wondered, not only with him, but also, which I think is conveyed in this story, I also wonder about a lot of really well-known people that make great social change, do amazing things, but how is their family affected? What happens to them? And what takes place? So this story, I have that Rahula, as he grows up, discovers his father involved with one of the nuns, just very peripherally, but he thinks it's something much more than what it is. He's fed up. He wants nothing to do with him. So he leaves and goes to Sri Lanka and exiles himself into exile. And there he's married and has a child named Savarna and Bodhi. And this story takes place in two places at the same time. One is Yashodhara is on the outskirts of Rajagaha, which is where her husband, when he became known as the Buddha, was one of the first places he taught. And this is where she is dying of what we nowadays would call congestive heart failure in this story. And she is in a small hut on the outskirts, and her cousin, Kisa, who is a real true-life character, is taking care of her. And Ananda, who is also a friend, and also was the Buddha's main disciple and continued teaching for many years, over all the 40 years he was teaching. Ananda's taking care of her during the day, and Kisa leaves her family at night and comes and stays with her at night. So while they are caring for her, she is talking about her life. And she is telling her story of what's happened to her before she was married, after she was married, once he left, and what took place afterwards when she became a nun, which she actually did in real life. And then what's happening up to that point. At the same time, Rahula in Sri Lanka has heard that his mother is dying and decides to come with Savarna and Bodhi and make the trek back to try to see her before she dies. And so it's all of their adventures of getting through all the things, travails they have to get through to get back home in time is interspersed. And they discover things about his father along the way that he didn't know. So this portion I'm going to read is Kisa is sitting with her, and she is recalling a time in her life, and they're in this small hut in Rajagaha. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes. Okay, good. Is everybody enlightened yet?
Getting there.
Anybody want to leave their family and become enlightened? A raggedy goat entered the hut and headed for the food Kisa had placed on the table. "Oh, no, you don't, you sneak," Kisa admonished as she chased the nosy creature out the front door, stooping low so as not to knock herself out on the sagging beam. She came back and complained, "Why don't you go back home or come live with us?" "You know I am not welcome in my father's house," I said. This is Yashodhara speaking in the first person. Holding myself up on one elbow and rubbing my eyes, Kisa lit the candle that sat on the rocks by the fire and placed it on the narrow nightstand by my bed. "You know that, Kisa, that after my parents died, my relatives insisted that I live the ascetic life I'd chosen. It doesn't matter that I've left the order." Yes, Kisa shook her head, as if I didn't know. and sat on the side of the bed. I thought about her parents, especially her father, and how incensed he'd been when she'd left home, remarried, and become a lady disciple of Siddhartha. He had refused to come to her wedding and hadn't spoken to her in 12 years. He'd never even met his own grandchildren. But surely, as the sun rises, you know you are welcome in our home, Kisa said. The children are almost grown, and we all adore you. She placed her hand on my chest as I put mine on hers. I have never doubted your friendship or your love, but this practice of dying must be mine, and no one else's to bear. And my Rahula will surely be returning any day. I could feel myself holding my son again. Nothing else could bring such peace. But thank you, Kisa. Thank you with all my heart for all our years as sisters of the way. You're as stubborn as ever, Kisa exclaimed as she went to fetch a cup of water. Remember the day you and Siddhartha were betrothed? You insisted I be your maid of honor, even though you knew I was a jealous beast. Kisa returned with the water, placed it in my shaky hands, then sat at the end of the bed, rubbing my swollen feet. The cool water felt good on my throat, and some dribbled down my chin. I lay back down and let myself enjoy Kisa's soothing touch. How could I not have my dearest friend at my wedding, I said. If there was anybody besides my mother whom I wanted to share my happiness with, it was you. Kisa smiled, but I could feel a tinge of jealousy pass through her fingertips even after all these years. I thought I would burst, I said. I have never felt so beautiful in all my life. People looked at me as if I was about to join with God himself. Relatives arrived from as far away as Hara. Massive tents with silk flags were erected all over the grounds. And food, remember the food? Kisa nodded. Platters and platters of every fruit known to man. But best of all, my friends and family. It was amazing, Kisa confirmed, still rubbing my feet. And then, I exclaimed, to see that incredibly beautiful man come into sight, to be mine to hold, to adore, to love, it took my breath away. We both sighed. When he took my hand, I thought I would faint from his velvet touch. I could feel his smooth, strong, and tender touch as we walked in a circle around the priest, made our offerings, and said the marriage prayers, vows, and blessings. I felt like tearing off his clothes and taking him right then and there. We both laughed. If I had some magic powder, I would have thrown it on the priest and family members and made them disappear. My hand caressed my skin like a soft petal of jasmine as it moved down my stomach and across my thigh. But you know how long those stupid priests could drone on and on. Kisa nodded and smiled. When Krishna Bhati and I were married, our village came to a halt. It seemed like it went on for weeks. I was exhausted and happy. She stopped rubbing my foot. You could say I was happily exhausted, and not just from the wedding. She raised her eyebrows and we both giggled. Then she started rubbing my other foot. Thank goodness Davidya and I just ran off. It was so much simpler and I don't think any less romantic. Well, maybe a little. Staying in a boarding house over a dance hall in Benares wasn't quite the same as a palace and feast of gold, but he's a very giving, caring man, and I've never doubted his commitment to me and his girls. Something is missing when Kisa speaks about Davidya. I know Davidya loves Kisa, but I've never had the feeling that Kisa ever loved anyone as much as she did Siddhartha and Krishna Bhati. She accepted a life of security and contentment with someone who loves her. Maybe that's enough. Who am I to say? What a night, I agreed, referring to my wedding. Kisa grinned and blushed simultaneously. In all the years we'd known one another, I don't believe she'd ever heard me speak so intimately about Siddhartha. I have never felt so complete, so filled, so touched in all my life. My eyes were wet. He was so tender and yet so strong. Kisa's eyes fluttered shut. It seemed as if she was simultaneously imagining Siddhartha's touch. Even though our monthly flows had stopped years ago, I could tell we were sharing the memories of our flesh when our flesh was ripe with desire and longed for the men we loved. To leave that, to leave me, us, I'll never understand. I said, tears running down my cheeks like a waterfall. Kisa wrapped me in her arms. The earth could have split in two, but we didn't notice. We held on tightly, lost in a flood of memories. After eternity had come and gone, we wiped our faces on the hand towel Kisa had washed the day before and laughed as hard as we had cried. Remember, Kisa, desire is a trap, I winked as she finished the sentence. And desirelessness is liberation. We laughed again. Just think, I said, how many years I believed in that rubbish, only to realize I had done it all out of desire anyway. It wasn't all rubbish, Kisa said. You taught me some valuable life lessons you picked up from Siddhartha. Name one. Well, Kisa thought for a moment. You were an expert at begging. I never saw anybody refuse you food when you held out your bowl. We grinned knowingly as I batted my eyes and held out my hands with an imaginary bowl. And, Kisa continued coyly, you made such an entrance with the same outfit again and again and again. I moved my forth as if walking, showing off a fancy gown. Really, Kisa said seriously, you found some kind of peace, and it's rubbed off on me. After all those years of practice and meditation, it was, well, still is, a blessing to be in your presence. I squinted in disbelief. Me? Yes, Kisa said. You are peace and compassion. No matter what's going on around you, no matter how intense the drama or situation, you have always been a calming influence. Come on, I whispered. Stop it. Acceptance of praise, however, has not been one of your strong suits, Kisa chided. I blushed. Remember when your brother Devadatta came looking for Gautama and said he wanted to kill the jackal for all he'd done to you? How could I forget? You'd only been a nun a short time, Kisa said, but your compassion preceded you. He was hurt, I explained. He adored Siddhartha. After we were married, he and Siddhartha became good friends. They hunted together. Devadatta looked up to him. He told me how strong Siddhartha was, how far he could shoot his arrows, how smart he was with questions and problems. Siddhartha was more of a big brother to him than a brother-in-law. It's only natural he felt that way. I took a sobering breath. I had similar feelings. Remember when Siddhartha came home to visit his family and I refused to see him? It had been 12 years since he'd left, and I still couldn't forgive him. My heart returned to those difficult days. I remember how embarrassed Siddhartha's father, Subhananda, had been to see his son in rags begging for food. At first sight, his father refused to see him, but was later convinced by his wife, Pajapati, to have an audience with his ascetic son, the son who had studied all the new scriptures called the Upanishads, who had practiced every form of self-denial known by the great yogis at the time, who had evidently found peace of mind by following his own path and sharing it with others. Kisa learned about the meeting from Pajapati, who became a stream enter or follower in her later years and traveled with Siddhartha. The king, upon hearing his son's explanations about life, suffering, and liberation, was moved to tears. He wished Siddhartha every blessing, and years later, just before his own death, became a lay disciple. Some say he attained the peace beyond all peace, known as samadhi. Pajapati had said that Siddhartha, at the meeting with his father, had asked about my whereabouts and why I was not in attendance. Pajapati told him that even though I had been in mourning since his departure, I still remained faithful to him as a wife. When I heard that Siddhartha had shaved his head, I did likewise. When I found out that he ate only at certain times, so did I. And when I discovered that he had renounced high beds and fancy clothes, I did the same. He reportedly asked his disciples, Moggallana and Sariputta, to come with him and warned them that the princess is not yet free. She is exceedingly sorrowful. Allow her grief to run its course. I refused to see him, but the king, my father-in-law, insisted. When Siddhartha entered, I averted my eyes. My anger struck him like a cobra. He said he had caused me unspeakable grief. He said he knew a way for me to release my suffering. Instead of saying he was returning or asking me to go with him, he told me about the Eightfold Path and the Middle Way. Not once did he ask about our son. I felt I had two confused demons fighting inside me. One wanted to kill Siddhartha, and the other one wished to embrace him. That's still the beginning of the story. And when you read the story, you'll find there's a number of things that have happened, that have taken place since then, that really reaffirm the questions about how minimized not just Yashodhara was over time, but also all the nuns. In many countries around the world, it's still very patriarchal. It's still very rare to have women involved as the top of the order. Women are still not allowed to go out on their own. And I think the sense, we feel it's so, because of where we live here and the Buddhists that I know and that we know, we don't think of that, or at least I haven't for all the time, but it's still a reality in many, many places, and has been for a long time. There was a woman in Sri Lanka who wrote me after this book came out, and she was all excited, and then she read it, and then she got really upset and said, "How can you say this about her?" And she was because she was very traditional and felt that Buddha was like a god that could do no wrong and never did any wrong and was perfect even before he became the Buddha. And that Yashodhara was also a saint, and that they're both saints, and nobody should ever say anything about them different. And she thought I was being sacrilegious by writing this story. So I've had forgotten that just like other religions, there are some people that have taken all the humanness out of people and people's lives, who have been teachers, great spiritual teachers. And hopefully what I've done in this book and in this story is make them more real to us here and now, make them more human, and have many of the same emotions and reactions that we would now we were in similar situations. So, thank you. And if there's some questions or comments, and the cinematographer back there with George Lucas has a question.
Could you talk a little bit about the process you go through? Do you sketch out your characters first, or do you do a timeline, or what was the process you do when you do sort of it's historical, but it's a novel? How do you balance that?
Right. Of the 12 books I have, 10 of them are nonfiction. I've only done other book of fiction, and that was based on a real life person who I interviewed for a period of time, and then changed the story. And it's a nurse who used to work at hospice, or she still does work at hospice, and it's called It's About Time, and it's she's from Austria, and so in that story, I pretty much followed a lot of what happened to her. In this, I did as much research as I could, not only about her, because there wasn't much about her, but also about Siddhartha and their families, and after he became the Buddha, and different places he was at, different teachings, different things that happened, and included those in the story. And I wrote it all out, although I didn't know what was going to happen at the end. I wrote everything out. The characters, I used all the real names and real people, so I didn't have to create the characters in that respect. And then I just went from her. I don't remember how I got the idea that she was in the process of her ending days of life as a way to tell her story and talk about the past. I don't remember how that came about, but does that answer the question about how I wrote this down, or how I came about?
Well, you mentioned when you first started this, there was only two sentences.
Right.
And it's because, did you learn a lot more once the internet kicked in?
Yes, I have. And I've learned more since the book has come out, because all these people have contacted me. There's a nun in Oakland who turns out has been studying Yashodhara for 20 years. And she has a lot of original texts from Sri Lanka that from Pali language, not from there, but have been transmitted orally to nuns in Sri Lanka and have been passed on from generation to generation. There was never a lot written down about Yashodhara, but there has been a lot of oral traditions consistently passed down for the years. And like all oral traditions, I don't know how much is same as written. I don't know how much has actually happened and how much didn't. With Siddhartha, who became the Buddha, after he started teaching, he continued going up and down India for almost over 40 years teaching. So there's a lot of collaboration from a lot of people who later on wrote down what they witnessed and what he said. So there's much more validity behind that I could find as far as what happened in his life, but less so with hers. But I have been discovering more as time has gone on. I actually discovered recently a book that was written in 1962 by a woman in India named Vahala called Amapali, which was about the first woman who became a nun and a follower. And it was fascinating how it was a book of fiction, but there was a lot of much more historical facts in it, I believe, that she knew that I didn't. But some of the reactions she has on Amapali having to Buddhism and to the Buddha are the same as I wrote about in here, which is really fascinating. So, yes? Hi.
You mentioned that the traditional religious Buddhist lady said that the Buddha never did anything, quote, wrong, unquote. Do you think that what he did was wrong?
That is a question, and that's one of the questions that's raised throughout the story. And I wouldn't say that it was wrong. It's just the choice that was made, and it had effects on a lot of people. And some people would say the greater good because it's helped so many people throughout the ages. And you could make that same argument for other people. I personally could never see doing that. I could never, ever do that. I knew I wanted to have kids and have a family since I was 16, or even 14, and had two wonderful children with my ex-wife Pat, and then other children since. And I just the thought of leaving your partner, let alone your newborn child, who you'd been waiting for 10 years, to go find something that you didn't know what, that somehow you felt compelled to do, that staying and becoming the next king was not what you wanted to do, that staying in the relationship was not possible because there was something else that you had to discover. I could never do that. And yeah, I can never do that, but I don't know if I would label it as wrong or judge it as wrong. Just different, so yeah.
What have you found out about Buddha's wife since you wrote the book?
Since writing it, the things that I found out is that, which one of the things I already knew. She later became a nun herself, which I talk about in the book here. In my story, she leaves the order later on, in later life, but in actuality, she was a nun her entire life, and was one of the first ones to start a monastery for nuns, for women, and that's the other point. A lot of people don't know Buddha was really against having women become followers and becoming involved in the order, and I speak about that, and they talk about it a number of times in a number of places. Again, I think here and where we are now, we think it's just accepted and it's not even a question. But for many years, after he had numerous followers and had been teaching for a number of years, a lot of women, including his stepmother, Pajapati, kept coming and saying, we want to become nuns, we want to become nuns. And he said, no, you can't. It's not a life for women. You can't do this. And he even said that, quote, he felt that women would be a blight upon the order. And it was actually Pajapati and some other women talking to Ananda, who was his primary disciple, talking to his primary disciple, who got him to speak to the Buddha and ask him some questions and sort of trick him into accepting women in the order. And he asked them, well, can animals obtain enlightenment and be enlightened and have this awakened nature? And the Buddha said, well, yes, of course they can. And said, well, can, other beings, can all beings? And he said, well, yes, they can. And they said, well, then cannot women also attain the same enlightenment and the same awakening? And Buddha said, supposedly reluctantly, well, yes, yes, they can. Then why don't you allow them to become nuns?
Because they have to stay home and take care of the kids so the guys can go to the monastery.
So, well, that was part of it. A lot of, at the beginning, no, that's a good, she said, so that they can stay home and take care of the kids while the other guys go and become followers of the monastery. And at the beginning, that is a lot of what happened. A lot of young guys, especially from other groups, went and became followers and left families at home. And he said, and when he finally agreed, he said, yes, they can, but they have to follow these 18 additional things that the men don't have to follow. And these regulations, these rules. And one of the biggest things he said, he felt that they would be too much of a hindrance and a desire for the male monks. It couldn't be the other way around at all, of course, but that it would be, and for some reason they couldn't practice with women around. So he finally agreed, and they've been in the order ever since. But they had to really fight to get involved. And so, in many ways, it's really remarkable. In some ways, it was revolutionary what the Buddha did in that time and place, and where he was, to allow all people to become followers, regardless of caste, regardless of their station in life, regardless of whether they're wealthy or poor, was enormous. And he got incredible, people going back at him about that and upset about it. For him to say there were no gods, to say that there was no gods to pray to make life better or to have things work out for you, that there wasn't any one or many gods, was also revolutionary at that time and place. And also then, as it is still true many places, women didn't go out alone by themselves. They always went in groups with other women or with male partners, which is also still true in many parts of Africa, Asia, Middle East, and South America. So even though he's reluctant to allow women in, and he finally did, and that when he finally did, that was also another huge. No other religious spiritual groups at that time, and even though they had in the past had women involved, and many do now, at that time they didn't. So again, when he finally did, that was also very revolutionary to do, even though it wasn't with the full amount of rights that we would see now. So, yes.
Did you learn more about the son he had?
She asked if I learned more about his son, about the son that they had, Rahula. I did. It was interesting. When he was 12 and his father came back, and he met him for the first time, when he came back to the kingdom, after he heard his father speak, he wanted to go become a follower. And his mother at the time said, and his mother and his grandfather, who was the king, said, no way. We already lost one son. no, husband, you aren't going. You have to at least wait till you're 16. If you still want to go then, you can go. They didn't say with their blessings because they didn't want him to go. So he waited till he was 16, and then he became a follower. And he became a monk himself, and supposedly never married or had any children, even though my next book, which takes place in Silicon Valley, says otherwise. So but there was never much written about him at all. I never learned much more than that he became a monk himself and was a follower until he died.
Thank you.
Uh-huh. Yes.
Piggybacking onto her question, if you wrote this book now after what you know via the internet and all your knowledge, what would you change? What else would you change?
I've thought about that actually already for the next reprinting. Other than a few facts about some things that I have off by a number of years, not much. Not much at all, because a lot of the story is really, a lot of it is fictional based on what was really interesting part of their relationship to me, and the effects it has on people's relationship, and what love is in a relationship, and what the other big question that I hope you'll get when you read this is, my sense was some people, I don't know if this is true for Buddha or not, some people find it easier to connect and talk and be with lots of other people and to love other people and be loved by lots of other people as a teacher, as a religious person, etc. And yet it's really difficult for them to have a one-to-one, close, intimate, personal relationship with somebody. And I wonder sometimes if that is because of the fear of loving and losing, or of being that intimate and having to have all your stuff come up all the time. Because being in an intimate relationship with somebody brings up more stuff than anything I know of. And so if you can do it there, you can do it anywhere. And so that's the other, I don't know if that, but I say in the story I have Yashodhara talking about that to Kisa and Ananda, talking about how she feels that is true about Siddhartha, that he was afraid of staying in a one-on-one relationship is one of the reasons he left. She didn't say that she thought that was the only reason. And that he was okay with giving, but it was really difficult for him to receive. He didn't know how to receive. So, yes?
For me, it also seems like there's a dynamic of, loving is, very often what I've observed is people sort of love this. Somebody gave me a line, says, "I will always love the man I thought you were." And that having to come to terms with who somebody really is and still continuing to love them. Because I think in the beginning, most of us have our thoughts about who this person is, and sometimes there's a big discrepancy there, or things that we could not have possibly anticipated. And that, what is that experience? It seems like this is sort of an ultimate test of that.
Yes, that's a very good example of the of living with a person that the image we have of somebody as opposed to how they really are, or how we want somebody to be, as opposed to how they really are, or how we want to be, or ourselves also. Yeah. Yes.
When he left, what was her position in her group or tribe?
There's not much talk about her being shamed, or because she was, and I haven't heard that she felt that way, that was not her concern as far as being shame. She was just in incredible grief for years and years and years over his leaving. Intense grief and sadness, and always part of her expecting and hoping that somehow he would return and become king, which is what his father was always hoping also. So, yes?
I always wonder about super egos when you get into people like this, and I don't know, just superiority and those kinds of attitudes and complexes that make people either super egos, or some of them become control freaks, but if they choose to be alone, there sometimes it's a rejection, or not realizing they couldn't possibly adapt or accept or be flexible enough to accept someone they thought would be disappointing or inferior, or disillusioned or something. I don't know. It just always kind of strikes me when someone is that exclusively.
Yeah, she was saying that when people's sense of super ego, and some people get so difficult that they prefer to be alone because either somebody else doesn't, quite match up, or never good enough, or etc. in a relationship. Acceptance and adaptability for that. And once, from my understanding and I guess it's a belief in Buddha's teaching and what he taught, the truth that he discovered and how he acted in his life, I don't have the sense that it was ever out of ego.
Oh, good. That's good.
My sense is that he actually, choosing to continue teaching for so many and traveling was really hard and not an easy thing to do. I didn't get that sense, but it could be partly. Yes, you had a question?
Well, I was just going to say that while I don't agree with what he did, having done the opposite, being next to you can't really discuss it in our contemporary Western terms of relationships and love as we know it as Westerners today. You have to think of it in the Buddhist terms of attachment and the journey towards enlightenment and letting go, and see it in some degree as a metaphor.
Right. I don't know if everybody heard, she talked about using detachment as that was the ultimate metaphor for practicing detachment, of leaving everything that mattered to him at the time in order to go beyond that and to find something else, and looking at it in that time and place. And it's difficult to put that in our modern culture. And actually, I agree, and I think that's the other perspective also, that perhaps this was the hardest thing he could have done in his life, as opposed to staying would have been the easiest thing, because everything was supplied. And also in those times and days, men had very little involvement with their children most of the time. Other people, especially kings, other people were taking care of them all the time. So, but I also think you can place it in modern days. I think there's both. I think that both, that some of that may also have been true, because she really did react, and it really did have huge effects on the family. And also there is that part of it too, that he, some people would say that he made the ultimate sacrifice.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think we can. I know someone who left his family in order to be like the Buddha, and I don't agree with that. But I mean, I think that in pursuing any kind of path, you need your attachment.
I used to, for years, I used to think you had to do one or the other. When I was you had to be spiritual and go off somewhere, or you had to be a householder and be at home and be in the midst of everything. I was in it for years. Every time I saw that movie, Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, about St. Francis, and I saw it 18 times at the Nickelodeon Theater. It was before videotapes or anything like that. Every time I saw that, I go, I'm going to go become a monk. And then there's the scene in there where there's this one monk who sees this woman, and he says, oh, go get married and have kids, because if we all became monks, what would happen to the human race? And I realized that, no, I always want a family, I couldn't do it. But, yeah.
Yeah, there's some ages of Tibetan Buddhism that are ley lineages.
Yeah.
You definitely don't have to do one or the other.
No, you don't. You can do both. And although I think it's in some ways much more difficult, well, I don't know, it's more difficult, it's just different to be in a relationship and do it. So I think, yeah, teaching and being love and compassion, but not able to receive love and compassion. In this story, and personally, I'm not saying that he could never receive love and compassion. He may have been able to receive just as much love and compassion as he transmitted and taught about, and other people how to find it. What I write is that Yashodhara, for her, she questions that. She raises that question if that's one of the reasons that he left. And she always wonders that and feels that perhaps it is. And maybe it was, but I don't know.
I think I heard you speak to this a little bit earlier, but since you wrote this as a piece of fiction and not sort of historical reference, and what are you hoping the reader will take away? What sort of feeling were you putting in that you want people to close the book at the end? I have not read it yet. How do you want people to feel what you think?
Whenever I get to the ending, even though I wrote it, I still cry at the ending every time I read the ending. I think the thing that is for people, I really hope that people will get the sense of the humanness and the reality of what took place in the past is happening right now, here and now in our lives, and how we react and the choices we make, and mostly about love and forgiveness and compassion overcome anything and everything, all situations and circumstances. So I would say that's what I hope.
Thank you
Yes.
very, very much.
Thank you.